Hey, I'm Jeremy Schwartz, host of American Criminal. In this season, a pair of criminals form a special bond and go on a cross-country killing spree. Or do they? Listen to American Criminal, Serial Killers, Serial Liars, wherever you get your podcasts. Or to get ad-free access to the entire season first, subscribe at intohistory.com.
It's summer 1934 at a radio station in Des Moines, Iowa. A young broadcaster sits in a small booth in front of a single microphone. Next to him, a fellow named Curly sits in front of a telegraph machine. Curly's typing a message onto a piece of paper. He rips out the page and hands it to the broadcaster, who reads it nearly word for word. Bill Jurgis steps up to the plate for the Cubs. Broadcaster is in the middle of calling a baseball game between the Cubs and the Cardinals. The Cubs shortstop Billy Jurgis is the first batter up. Dizzy Dean readies himself for the first pitch. His season has been one for the record books, folks. Though Wrigley Field is some 300 miles away, the broadcaster helps give the radio listeners at home the illusion of a play-by-play experience. He has plenty of help. In a small booth at Wrigley Field in Chicago, telegraph operators watch the game live and tap out the action in coded messages that are then sent to operators at various regional radio stations like this one. But this particular broadcaster has a knack for the job. He's only been to Wrigley Field once, but he still has an uncanny ability to convince his listeners he's right there in the action, watching every pitch, taking in the sights and sounds of the ballpark, just like they would be if they were there. As Curly decodes and types out the next message, the broadcaster tees up the action to come. Dizzy Dean winds up and lets go with the first pitch. Curly slips him another piece of paper. When the broadcaster sees the message, his face goes white. There's no outcome typed on it. The message simply reads, "The wire has gone dead." The broadcaster looks to Curly for some further explanation, but only receives a shrug. Communication between Wrigley Field and the booth in Des Moines is down, but the broadcaster has already told his listeners there's a pitch heading to the plate at this second. So he thinks on his feet. Jurgis fouls one off behind third base. Curly gives him a curious look. This time, the broadcaster shrugs. He knows his station isn't the only one covering the game. If he doesn't keep talking, his audience will tune in elsewhere. He's always said radio is a theater of the mind, an opportunity to use his imagination and create stories to share with his listeners. This is his chance to prove it. And Jurgis fouls another one off. Dean goes with the rosin bag. He's pitched a scoreless game so far and doesn't want to rush anything. He steps back onto the mound, shakes off a sign from his catcher, shakes off another. Dean goes into a long windup, finally lets go with another pitch. Jurgis makes contact. It has a chance. Just foul in right field. For nearly 6 minutes, the Des Moines broadcaster improvises the events of the game without any real information. Finally, the wire comes back on. Curly slips him another piece of paper. The message reads, "Jurgis popped out on the first ball pitched." Curly looks worried, but the broadcaster just smiles. He's told a good story, and he's kept his audience engaged. As far as he's concerned, he's done his job. Curly didn't know it then, and neither did the many fans listening at home. But in the summer of 1934, that broadcast announcer took a small step towards becoming a national celebrity. After his days calling ball games in Des Moines, the broadcaster would go on to become a famous actor. He would rise to prominence inside his union, and his time serving in a leadership role in the Screen Actors Guild would set the stage for his entrance into the world of politics. After being elected the governor of California, Ronald "Dutch" Reagan would set his sights on the White House. But to win the presidency, just as he had done in his days as a baseball announcer, Reagan would have to rely on his folksy charm and his natural ability to tell a good story. From Airship, I'm Lindsey Graham, and this is American Election's Wicked Game. Ronald Reagan loved telling stories. Later in his life, he'd gleefully recount his moments in the booth during that Cubs-Cardinals game to biographers and members of the press, occasionally changing a detail or two and suggesting it had been a turning point in his career. Dutch, a childhood nickname stemming from his Dutch boy haircut, had never been one to settle for something just because he was good at it. He enjoyed his work, but calling games from hundreds of miles away wasn't enough. He wanted to tell stories on a larger scale and reach a bigger audience. This desire led him from a radio booth in Iowa to the film sets of Hollywood. Reagan worked in movies consistently in the late 30s, and while he was never considered one of the great actors of the era, he did become a household name. He dated and eventually married Jane Wyman, his co-star in the 1938 film Brother Rat. His notoriety grew as Reagan and Wyman became one of Hollywood's favorite celebrity couples. In 1940, Reagan's notoriety and his love of sports and movies helped him secure what would prove to be his most famous film role, Notre Dame football player George Gipp. Playing the Gipper cemented Reagan's image in American pop culture and eventually put him in a position to take on a leadership role in the Screen Actors Guild. During the sometimes violent strikes of the Conference of Studio Unions in 1946, Ronald Reagan proved to be such an effective communicator with both SAG leadership and rank-and-file members that he quickly rose from third VP to president of the Screen Actors Guild. This was in many ways Reagan's first foray into politics. Navigating the egos and disparate agendas of union membership taught Reagan a lot about compromise and the pressures of leadership. Perhaps more importantly, his time as SAG president put him directly at odds with the labor movement. Reagan had been subjected to what he called near constant bullying, sometimes even physical violence during labor disputes. This, maybe more than anything, started to shift his political views. When he came to Los Angeles in the 30s, he'd been a staunch Democrat who idolized President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When he left his position at SAG, he'd already moved to the right politically. By the early 60s, he officially joined the Republican Party and became a leading voice of a movement that for decades had conservatives in both parties struggling to make their message more appealing. But by the 1970s, conservatism was on the rise. In the minds of many Americans, President Johnson's Great Society, a set of domestic policies aimed at eliminating poverty and racial inequality, had been an abject failure. Many Americans were ready for a change. Many Republicans hoped Reagan would lead the charge. With his second wife, Nancy, at his side, Reagan gave voice to these sentiments and told the story of an America that was going in the wrong direction. With wide support out west, Reagan made his move into American politics and served 2 terms as governor of California from 1967 to 1975. For many conservatives, Governor Reagan made the perfect presidential candidate. His unique talents on the political stage would earn him the nickname the Great Communicator. But for many moderate Republicans, Reagan's conservatism was too much for the American people to take. In the midst of a struggle between moderate and conservative Republicans, Reagan would rise to power. It might be said that Reagan's campaign for president in 1980 began 4 years earlier at the 1976 Republican National Convention. Though he failed to secure the nomination then, Reagan used his oratorical skills to lay the groundwork for his political future and to take the Republican Party in a bold, new direction. This is episode 49, 1980, Carter versus Reagan. Let's make America great again. It's Thursday, August 19th, 1976, inside Kansas City, Missouri's Kemper Arena. Ronald Reagan takes center stage at the Republican National Convention. He's just lost the nomination to Gerald Ford in a hotly contested convention. But now, with the battle over, Ford has asked Reagan to say a few conciliatory words in a show of party unity. As Reagan steps to the podium, many GOP leaders in the crowd wonder if Reagan will extend an olive branch or fan the flames of division.
There are cynics who say that a party platform is something that no one bothers to read and it doesn't very often amount to much. Whether it is different this time than it has ever been before, I believe the Republican Party has a platform that is a banner of bold, unmistakable colors with no pale pastel shades.
Many in the crowd leap to their feet. Reagan does not take shots at Gerald Ford. Instead, from the very beginning, he praises the strength and vision of the Republican Party.
We have just heard a call to arms based on that platform, and a call to us to really be successful in communicating and reveal to the American people the difference between this platform and the platform of the opposing party, which is nothing but a revamp and a reissue and a running of a late show of the thing that we've been hearing from them for the last 40 years.
Reagan owns his moment in the spotlight. Without effort, he shifts topics and asks the convention crowd to imagine Americans 100 years in the future. And then he asks those in the convention hall that night what message they might send to those future Americans.
You're going to write for people 100 years from now who know all about us. We know nothing about them. We don't know what kind of a world they'll be living in.
There is no teleprompter, no notes in his hand. Reagan prepared these remarks for an upcoming engagement in California, but as he uses them tonight, it appears he is speaking entirely off the cuff.
And suddenly, I thought to myself, if I write of the problems, they'll be the domestic problems of which the President spoke here tonight, the challenges confronting us, the erosion of freedom that has taken place under Democrat rule in this country, the invasion of private rights, the controls and restrictions on the vitality of the great free economy that we enjoy. These are our challenges that we must meet.
Reagan uses his future American story to shed light on what he sees as the threats facing the United States today. He continues to push the idea that American freedom is under attack from both a failing Democratic Party at home and from the Soviet Union abroad. He continues to whip up the crowd and calls on them to be the defenders of America's freedom.
Whether they have the freedoms that we have known up until now will depend on what we do here. Will they look back with appreciation and say, thank God for those people in 1976 who headed off that loss of freedom, who kept us now 100 years later free, who kept our world from nuclear destruction?
After Reagan's speech, one listener in the arena lamented, "We've nominated the wrong man." Decades later, many historians will look at this speech as the moment Ronald Reagan and the conservatives won the battle of ideas over the moderate wing of their party. At the time, though, many saw Reagan's loss to Ford as a victory for the moderates and the end of Ronald Reagan's political career. But Ronald Reagan was no stranger to losing. His life in Hollywood often consisted of being beaten out for parts by other actors, or simply being rejected by producers before having a chance to read for a role. It was widely believed that Reagan had lost out to Humphrey Bogart for the lead in Casablanca, despite the fact that Reagan was never even considered for the part. It was a business that at times declared you a loser even when you weren't actually playing the game. Reagan's experience in Hollywood taught him to take losing in stride and focus on trying to get the next job. But many thought there wasn't one in politics for Reagan. Despite his rousing speech at the convention, many in the country, especially Democrats, thought that this marked the end of the road for the former California governor. Reagan was not a young man. He would be 69 years old by the time of the 1980 election. This would make him over a year older than the oldest president ever elected at the time, William Henry Harrison, who had served for 30 days in the White House before passing away. To many, retirement seemed like the only logical option for Ronald Reagan. And for his own part, Reagan did little to change their minds the day after the convention. On Friday, August 20th, 1976, before leaving Kansas City to return to California, Reagan gathered those who had worked tirelessly for his campaign. Several were seen crying as Reagan thanked them profusely and said his goodbyes, telling them, "We lost, but the cause goes on." In those words, many political pundits heard a final departure from politics. The conservative movement will survive, Reagan seemed to say, but without him. However, Reagan didn't end his goodbye to his advisors, staff, and volunteers on that note. Instead, the storyteller is said to have reached back to his youth and recalled a few lines from an old ballad he knew about the Scottish sailor Sir Andrew Barton. "I'll lay me down and bleed a while. Although I am wounded, I am not slain. I shall rise and fight again." Democrats in the media could close the book on Reagan all they wanted, but those who knew him best knew Dutch was far from done. Wounded, perhaps, but not out of the fight. In 1976, Gerald Ford lost to Jimmy Carter in the presidential election, which Reagan and many other Republicans saw as a call for the party to finally embrace the conservative movement and make the shift to the right that Reagan had argued for throughout the 1976 campaign. Over the next 3 years, Reagan watched Carter flounder both at home and abroad. Under Carter's watch, inflation soared, unemployment rose, and the country moved into a recession. Republicans and even a significant number of Democrats came to view Carter as weak and helpless. They argued that another 4 years with him in the White House would diminish the United States standing on the world stage and weaken their fight against the Soviets. For many, these fears about Carter seemed justified when on November 4, 1979, Iranian militants protesting U.S. support for the Shah of Iran seized the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. With a beleaguered Democrat in the White House, the Republican Party saw an opportunity to take control as the 1980 election season approached. Answering the call, Ronald Reagan announced his candidacy for president on November 13, 1979 in New York City, less than 2 weeks after the Americans were taken hostage. For many, the staunch, outspoken opponent of communism was the clear choice to challenge President Carter. Supporters even pointed to his speech at the 1976 convention as his claim to be the next Republican nominee for president. Fully re-energized after his loss to Ford and eager to combat what he saw as true threats to the American way of life, Ronald Reagan chose a famous slogan, "Let's make America great again." He strove to demonstrate how the country's former greatness could only be regained through the conservative movement. Not everyone agreed, and Reagan soon found himself at odds once again with a moderate wing of his own party. Many of these moderates argued that Reagan's rhetoric towards the Soviet Union only served to push the United States closer to nuclear war. Others expressed fear that Reagan's brand of conservatism wouldn't play to the general population, and that if Reagan was their nominee, the Republicans would find themselves on the losing end of yet another national election. Still others pointed to down-ballot elections as a cause for concern and suggested Reagan might polarize the Republican base and bring down Senate and House candidates with him. The long-time divide between moderates and conservatives in the Republican Party led to a crowded field and a range of obstacles for Reagan. Early in the race, he was faced with multiple challengers, including Tennessee Senator Howard Baker, former Secretary of the Treasury John Connally, House members from Illinois Philip Crane and John B. Anderson, and Gerald Ford's running mate Bob Dole. Some moderates even pushed Gerald Ford to run again, and a will-he, won't-he narrative started to build around the former president. Journalist and biographer Lou Cannon would later write about those early days of the 1980 primary for the Washington Post, saying, "The entire Republican establishment tried to prevent Reagan from becoming the party's presidential nominee." But despite all the challengers, one man in particular would separate himself from the rest of the pack. Decorated World War II veteran and former head of the CIA, George Herbert Walker Bush would emerge as the party's best chance to stop Reagan and to keep Republicans in a more moderate lane. While Reagan held an image as a hero based on his roles in Hollywood movies, George H.W. Bush's supporters would try to show the American people that their candidate was the real thing. With his extensive military and intelligence background, Bush would be presented as a president we won't have to train. And on the campaign trail, the two men would often find themselves at odds. They would rarely find common ground on economic policy or the best way to deal with the Soviets. Additionally, their vastly different personalities would create a sense that the two men simply didn't like each other. When asked by a campaign aide about his feelings towards Bush, Reagan would simply say that Bush lacked spunk. The contest between Reagan and Bush, then, would come to symbolize the conflict within the party itself. While Reagan would maintain his frontrunner status early on, George H.W. Bush would do everything in his power to deliver an upset victory in the country's first vote of the election season. Bush believed that a surprise victory in Iowa could cast doubt on Reagan's campaign and change the face of the Republican primary.
Você que está ouvindo o seu podcast, sabia que tudo que o Google faz tem a intenção de trazer impacto positivo? Como? O Jefferson da Tributei usou inteligência artificial para facilitar o dia a dia das empresas. Ele e milhares de empreendedores geraram mais de 188 bilhões com as plataformas do Google. E a Miriane se formou em UX com certificados profissionais do Google, criando o seu próprio negócio. Ela e 88% dos formados relataram avanços profissionais como promoção ou novo emprego. Tem que ser bom para todo mundo. Google.
Você que está ouvindo o seu podcast e curte fazer um bom negócio, vai aí uma dica imperdível. A nova Chevrolet S10 está na sua melhor versão, bruta e macia ao mesmo tempo. De um lado, toda a força e potência de uma picape bruta, invocada e conectada. Do outro, todo o conforto que só a nova suspensão proporciona, muito mais macia e silenciosa, deixando suas viagens ainda mais confortáveis. É a nova S10 que você conhece e confia, ainda mais bruta, brutalmente macia. Acesse chevrolet.com.br para saber mais.
It's early January 1980. George H.W. Bush takes the stage at the Des Moines Civic Center for the first-of-its-kind Republican primary debate in Iowa. The last time two Republican candidates held anything close to a primary debate was in 1948, when New York Governor Thomas Dewey and former Minnesota Governor Harold Stassen went head-to-head over the issue of communism days before the Oregon primary. Bush had spent much of the past year crisscrossing the state, engaging in what experts blithely called retail politics. But the strategy had paid off, and Bush has gone from being an asterisk in early polls to a rising favorite among voters and a winner of multiple Iowa GOP straw polls. But on the advice from his campaign manager, John Sears, Ronald Reagan has chosen to skip the debate. Reagan's advisors told him that as the frontrunner, the event is unnecessary. So Bush sees this moment as his chance to steal the top spot from Reagan and sell himself to the American people as a moderate who will work across the aisle.
I support the multilateral efforts that the president is making in trying to mobilize the UN.
The issue on the table, not surprisingly, is the ongoing hostage crisis in Iran. While other Republicans on the stage stress President Carter's failures and the United States' need to take unilateral action against Iran, Bush remains pragmatic. As the former ambassador to the UN, he knows firsthand how difficult it can be for the UN to take action. Still, he believes the United States can show strength without having to go it alone. And he does not see attacking President Carter as the best way to secure the safe return of the hostages in Iran.
As the president indicates, a certain escalation and tightening of things in relation to the hostage situation, I'll support him.
In discussing Iran, Bush manages to distinguish himself from the other men on the stage. But Bush knows the candidate he has to beat is the one who isn't there. When the candidates are asked how they differ from Ronald Reagan, Bush seizes the opportunity to paint himself as the more experienced candidate.
And look at the experience I've had in foreign affairs, being your ambassador in China, your ambassador in the United Nations, running the Central Intelligence Agency, being head of this party on a full-time basis.
Bush reiterates his central campaign message. He won't need training. He will be ready on day one. While he's able to lean heavily on his foreign affairs experience, Bush highlights his expertise on domestic affairs too, and the economy, to further distance himself from Reagan, who came to politics via Hollywood.
And so I would emphasize, in answer to the question, that the breadth of experience I've had and the conviction I have in foreign affairs and domestic affairs and building a business, I believe the only candidate here that did that, met a payroll, I believe those things are very important.
Highlighting his experience proved to be the right move for George H.W. Bush. His debate performance was viewed as a success. Many pundits declared him the clear winner of the night. And so Bush's growing reputation as the smart, moderate choice and his Iowa organization's strong ground game brought him within striking distance of Ronald Reagan when the polls opened on January 21st, 1980. By the time the results were in later that night, George Bush had pulled off an upset. He had soundly beat Ronald Reagan and the rest of the field at the Iowa caucus. With an early delegate lead, he turned his eyes immediately to New Hampshire and looked for a way to make the next major debate an even bigger success than the one in Iowa. Sitting on his campaign plane as it headed from Iowa to New Hampshire, George Bush recounted World War II stories for the press pool. Writer Walter Shapiro was on board, and he would later note that while telling war stories, Bush refrained from discussing personal heroics, despite the fact that he had been a decorated naval aviator. Instead, Bush liked to regale listeners with dramatic tales of mishaps on aircraft carriers and lay out plane formations using salt and pepper shakers. Shapiro suggested the calm, humble Bush showed on the flight to New Hampshire was in direct contrast to some of his past behaviors on the campaign trail. One of the more famous and somewhat surprising moments had occurred at a YMCA in Des Moines. George Bush, generally thought to be reserved by nature, had gotten down on the ground and started doing push-ups in an attempt to prove that he was, in his words, up for the 80s, while Ronald Reagan, 13 years his senior, was not. But winning the Iowa caucus seemed to restore Bush's concentration, and he landed in New Hampshire feeling upbeat and determined to keep the momentum going, to keep the Big Mo, as he called it. The New Hampshire primary debate was still weeks away, but Bush was determined to get his message out to everyone who would listen. He believed if he could follow up his success in Iowa with a win in the Granite State, he would be seen nationwide as the Republican frontrunner. Ronald Reagan, though, was not one to panic. Remaining calm under pressure had helped him call baseball games even when the wire went down, and it had allowed him to maneuver the myriad of obstacles Hollywood presented. He'd been in far worse positions early in the 1976 primary against Gerald Ford, too. And though Reagan ultimately lost to Ford, he had overcome a huge deficit in polls and early primary votes to present a real challenge to the sitting president. So when people had counted Reagan out, he came roaring back and forced an open convention. When the votes were finally tallied in 1976, Ronald Reagan had come closer to unseating an incumbent Republican president than any Republican nominee since Teddy Roosevelt challenged William Howard Taft in 1912. But it was true the Iowa caucus was a disappointment to Reagan. Still, it was no cause to change his messaging or alter his strategy, he thought. Before Iowa, internal numbers from his campaign showed Reagan with a 19-point lead over Bush in New Hampshire. After Iowa, internal campaign numbers showed him trailing Bush by 6 points. Still, as far as anyone could see, Reagan wasn't panicking. Behind the scenes, though, his campaign manager John Sears was growing anxious. Still, Reagan saw New Hampshire as an opportunity to quickly right the ship. Despite trailing in the early delegate count, Reagan's camp firmly believed winning in New Hampshire could restore his frontrunner status, thin the Republican field, and set up a clear and easy path to victory. The New Hampshire debate would give Reagan the perfect opportunity to separate himself from the new moderate rival, George Bush. Much of Reagan's Let's Make America Great campaign focused on the United States' international standing. He argued for a more aggressive posture towards the Soviet Union. He promised that, if elected, the U.S. would engage in a massive rearmament effort and revisit SALT II, a proposed arms treaty with the Soviets that Reagan vehemently disagreed with. But while he and Bush differed in their approach to foreign policy, Reagan knew that wasn't the best way to attack his opponent. Bush had served bravely in World War II. He had worked as an ambassador, headed the CIA. His foreign policy credentials were a strength, not a weakness. So instead, Reagan would highlight the domestic aspects of his plan for making America great again. Reagan believed the federal government itself played a major role in the decline of America's success. He painted Washington, D.C. as a place run by entrenched bureaucrats with far too much power and an inability to get anything done. Reagan suggested that along with political elites and D.C. power brokers, Washington insiders had taken away the voice of the people. Reagan had been in politics for over a decade and had worked in Hollywood for 20 years before that. Still, he presented himself as a folksy Midwesterner who deeply understood the plight of the average American. Reagan knew George H.W. Bush could not say the same. As the scion of Prescott Sheldon Bush, a wealthy investment banker and former United States Senator from Connecticut, Bush was an elite. As someone who had worked in and around government for the larger part of his career, George Herbert Walker Bush could be painted as an insider, a part of the broken system that needed to be fixed. As Reagan continued to push his attacks on bureaucracy and big government leading up to the New Hampshire debate, some on the left and in the national media began to write him off. They accused Reagan of making misleading statements regarding the economy and U.S. foreign affairs. They noted how Reagan seemed to never have thought out what he was going to say, and so he appeared to stumble at times when speaking. But not all on the left were convinced that Reagan was not a threat. A former Democratic rival of Reagan's in California told The New Yorker, "He's not a fool. The national media underestimate him." For those who truly understood Reagan, they saw in him a brilliant performer who easily connected with rank-and-file Americans. In covering Reagan on the campaign trail, writer Elizabeth Drew said, "Reagan speaks to people's resentment. As in 1976, he is the candidate of indignation, and now he has added the politics of nostalgia. Reagan does not disappoint his audiences, nor they him." And it was exactly people's resentment and the politics of nostalgia that Reagan would use as weapons in New Hampshire to set himself apart from George Bush. The New Hampshire debate, scheduled to take place on February 23rd, had already sparked controversy among Republicans. Reagan had told his campaign manager John Sears he would not sit New Hampshire out as he'd done in Iowa. Once this was made public, the Bush camp sought a one-on-one debate with Reagan, believing this could be their chance to deliver a knockout blow to the rest of the field and prove that Iowa was not a fluke. Bush staffers and many among the Republican leadership saw New Hampshire as an opportunity to put an end to Reagan's chances for the presidency and to stifle the growing power of the conservative wing of the party. Having the two candidates alone on stage, they thought, gave Bush a much better chance to show why he was the right man to take on President Jimmy Carter in a national election. The Nashua Telegraph was set to host the debate, but the Federal Elections Commission informed the newspaper that if they were the debate sponsor, all of the primary candidates would have to take part. Neither Bush nor the paper wanted this, so they approached Reagan with another option. The Reagan camp could pay for the one-on-one debate, and it wouldn't be subject to the rules of the FEC. If Reagan paid, they could leave the other candidates off the stage. Reagan's campaign agreed to pay the $3,500 for the event and allowed the Telegraph to host it. Bush and those at the paper thought they had gotten everything they wanted, but like many in the national media, they had underestimated Ronald Reagan. As George Herbert Walker Bush prepared for what he saw as the most important night of his political career, Ronald Reagan endeavored to set up an event that ensured the story out of New Hampshire would solely focus on him. With the debate only a few days away, Reagan set the stage for a night that would come to be known as the turning point of the 1980 campaign. In the end, it wouldn't be Reagan's views on the federal government or his stance on the Soviet Union that would change the course of the Republican primary. It would simply be his long-held ability to improvise. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free, like Wild West Extravaganza, a journey back to the fascinating, tumultuous, and often violent world of the American Old West. From famous outlaws like Billy the Kid and Jesse James, to lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok, to trailblazing pioneers and frontiersmen, Wild West Extravaganza tells the true stories of the real-life characters who shaped this iconic era. So saddle up and discover the true history of the American frontier, the good, the bad, and the ugly, ad-free at intohistory.com. Tired of ads and promos like these? Want to skip ahead to newer elections? You can listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com. But not only that, you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also all ad-free. That includes the American Revolution podcast, a deep and thorough investigation of the times, people, and politics behind America's fight for independence. Also, the battles, because we can't start a new American nation without guns. And the American Revolution podcast tells the story of the Revolution from beginning to end, from its origins in the French and Indian War, through the war itself, and on to the founding of the United States. Get American Elections Wicked Game, the American Revolutions podcast, and many others ad-free with bonus content at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. Did you know you can skip ads and promos like these and listen to all episodes of American Elections Wicked Game without interruption by subscribing at intohistory.com? And not only will you be getting the whole series ad-free and bingeable, but you also get access to over a dozen more incredible history podcasts, also ad-free, like Her Half of History. Because even though Hillary Clinton may not have made history when she ran for president in 2016, there have always been women who seized power, spied for their country, created artistic masterpieces, even escaped slavery. Her Half of History is perfect for all those who sat in history class and wondered, what were the women doing all this time? Because the answer is a lot. Get Her Half of History, Wicked Game, and many others ad-free at intohistory.com. Subscribe now at intohistory.com. On Saturday, February 23, 1980, a raucous crowd of New Hampshire voters piled into the Nashua Senior High School auditorium to hear from two leading Republican candidates, Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Both campaigns understood the result in New Hampshire could likely decide how the primary would play out. If Bush could beat Reagan again, he could carve a wide path to the nomination, an outcome that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. If Reagan could right the ship in New Hampshire, though, he could write off Bush's Iowa performance as an aberration and reclaim his frontrunner status. John Breen, editor of the Nashua Telegraph and moderator for the debate, introduced the candidates, and Reagan and Bush took the stage. The crowd erupted. It wasn't the standard applause for a favorite candidate. Something else was happening inside the auditorium, and everyone knew it. Bush and Breen turned to see Senators Bob Dole and Howard Baker, and Illinois Representatives John Anderson and Phil Crane taking the stage. Unbeknownst to anyone in the Bush camp or at the Nashua Telegraph, Ronald Reagan had invited the rest of the candidates to participate in the event. He didn't tell Bush or Breen in advance. Stunned and feeling as though he'd been made to look like a fool, the moderator Breen attempted to shout down the crowd in order to make an announcement. He accused Reagan of breaking the rules of the debate. Reagan pushed back and asked to make an announcement of his own. As Reagan tried to speak, John Breen called for the sound man to cut off Reagan's microphone.
To make an announcement
Would the sound man please turn Mr. Reagan's mic off for a minute?
Is this on? Mr. Green,
Did you turn that microphone
you
off,
asked
please?
for me if you would... I am paying for this microphone, Mr. Green.
Crowd noise drowned out Breen's reply. Reagan then demanded Breen let the other candidates participate in the debate, and the crowd cheered even more. The improvised line, "I am paying for this microphone, Mr. Green," complete with a mispronunciation of John Breen's name, became the only news that mattered from the New Hampshire debate. Exchanges on foreign and domestic policy were easily washed over. Many people zeroed in on the fact that while Ronald Reagan took on the moderator and called for every candidate to be heard, George H.W. Bush froze and looked down at his notes. Reagan himself would later say his improvised line and his performance in New Hampshire may have won him the nomination. Years later, Bobby Malloy, the sound man who refused to cut Reagan's mic, gave an interview to a local New Hampshire TV station recounting the moment.
George H.W. Bush gets up on stage, and we've got some video we can take a look at. He goes up on the stage and goes up and has a drink of water, and you're clearly trying to sort of take command of the situation. And then Reagan goes up there. What is going on here? Are people confused at all about what's happening?
Yes, because I would say they really didn't know what the program was, because the playbill promoted the Bush-Reagan debate. And the other four came out with Reagan right behind him. And I kind of felt bad for them, because they were like little sheep being read, they were standing behind George Bush and they didn't say anything, they didn't do anything, they were just kind of motionless. And you're looking at them, they're like four lamps standing behind the guy, right?
Take us back to that day in Nashua. What did you notice about Governor Reagan as he arrived?
As he arrived, his face was red. He went over, and the first thing he did was he grabbed the microphone, and as you heard him say, "Is this thing on?" So he went up there and he wanted to explain to people what had actually transpired. And as he started to do it, John Breen asked me to turn the microphone off, which I obviously wouldn't do and didn't do.
Malloy then explains to another reporter why he wouldn't do it.
And I wouldn't do it for two reasons. Number one, I wouldn't be that rude to a man who's a guest in your auditorium. And secondly, he was in fact footing the bill for it.
In the end, Malloy thinks Reagan probably got his money's worth.
It was probably the best $3,500 he ever spent in his life.
Thanks in part to soundman Bob Malloy, Ronald Reagan went on to win New Hampshire easily, and several of the men Malloy called little sheep quickly dropped out of the race. George Bush kept fighting, though. He competed in 33 more primaries against Reagan. He lost 29. Calls for Bush to drop out of the race came from the Reagan crowd for months, but Bush believed the longer he stayed in, the better chance he had for the vice presidency. With the nomination fairly in hand, Reagan wasn't sure he wanted Bush as his VP. The two men disagreed on a number of issues of policy, and they had very different personalities. But Bush was a moderate, and many Republicans thought a moderate was exactly what Reagan needed on the ticket. When it became clear that Reagan would be the nominee, Reagan's conservatism became a much bigger issue in the media, and the idea of a Reagan presidency started to spark fear in many across the country. While campaigning for Jimmy Carter, Coretta Scott King, wife of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., said, "I am scared that if Ronald Reagan gets into office, we are going to see more of the Ku Klux Klan and a resurgence of the Nazi Party." Distrust of Reagan and the conservative movement caused John Anderson, recently a Republican candidate, to run for the president as an independent. So the GOP believed choosing a moderate running mate would ease some of the concerns among Republican and Democratic voters. Many suggested Reagan should call on his old rival, former President Gerald Ford, to run with him. They saw the Reagan-Ford combo as an unbeatable ticket. But there was talk that Ford would only join Reagan if Henry Kissinger was brought on to be Secretary of State and Alan Greenspan was chosen to head up Treasury. Those close to Reagan, and even Reagan himself, were said to view those demands as ludicrous. Greenspan and Kissinger were exactly the type of Washington insiders Reagan was running against. And then any further chance of a Reagan-Ford ticket vanished when Ford sat down for an interview with Walter Cronkite. Cronkite brought up a rumor that Ford and Reagan were working on a deal for a co-presidency. Watching at home, Reagan is said to have been appalled that Ford didn't deny the rumor outright. So on July 17, 1980, during the final day of the Republican National Convention, Reagan officially announced that George Herbert Walker Bush would be his running mate and that together they would keep Jimmy Carter from winning a second term. President Jimmy Carter had gone through his own battle in the Democratic primary, ultimately fending off a challenge from Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy. The heated contest had caused a split among Democrats, and many believed it further weakened Carter's chances of winning re-election. Still, despite a fractured party, economic troubles, and the lingering Iran hostage crisis, polls showed Carter and his running mate Vice President Walter Mondale in almost a dead heat with Reagan and Bush. In October, national polls went back and forth as both sides tried to map out the clearest path to victory. For Carter, coalitions in the North and West that he'd formed to win in '76 would have to hold. Reagan would have to win over moderates and rely on a growing contingent of conservative Republicans in the East. During the fall campaign, Reagan had also hoped to debate Carter, but the president had passed because independent candidate John Anderson was taking part. Carter didn't want to bolster Anderson's campaign in any way, and he saw only a benefit in letting the two wings of the Republican Party battle each other without a Democrat on stage as an added distraction. Carter might have been prudent to avoid a debate, because after his one-on-one debate with Reagan, Anderson's poll numbers plummeted, and his candidacy was all but over. So with national polls shifting between Reagan and Carter almost continuously, the American people seemed undecided. This changed Carter's calculus. It was now time to take on Reagan in a debate just 1 week before the election. So once again, with the cameras rolling and the American people watching at home, Ronald Reagan would shine. It's October 28, 1980. The public auditorium in Cleveland, Ohio is packed for the first and only debate between President Jimmy Carter and former California Governor Ronald Reagan. Carter and Reagan take their spots behind their podiums. It's clear early on that Carter hopes to paint Reagan as a trigger-happy arch-conservative itching for war with the Soviets and itching to take away any safety net for the American people.
Both I and all my predecessors have had a deep commitment to controlling the proliferation of nuclear weapons in countries like Libya or Iraq. We have even alienated some of our closest trade partners because we have insisted upon the control of the spread of nuclear weapons to those potentially terrorist countries. When Governor Reagan has been asked about that, he makes a very disturbing comment that non-proliferation or the control of the spread of nuclear weapons is none of our business.
But Reagan uses Carter's answer on terrorism to take a strong stand of his own and give the media a clear soundbite they can take away from the debate.
I believe it is high time that the civilized countries of the world made it plain that there is no room worldwide for terrorism. There will be no negotiation with terrorists of any kind.
Reagan goes on to deny Carter's accusation that non-proliferation was none of our business. But as often the case with Ronald Reagan, his most shining moment comes in an off-the-cuff remark. When Carter attacks Reagan for opposing Medicare and aspects of national health insurance for poor Americans, Reagan doesn't get angry or lose his cool. He smiles, chuckles, and utters a phrase that would become part of political lore.
There you go again.
But his most memorable words come in the final moments of the debate. In his closing remarks, Reagan talks directly to the American people and draws in his audience with his gift of gab.
Next Tuesday is election day. Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, you stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
The importance of the debate between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan was reflected in the number of people tuning in to watch. The almost 81 million television viewers made this the most watched presidential debate in American history. And that record would hold until the first debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump in 2016. The following day, news highlights of the debate were dominated by glowing reviews of Reagan's performance. And just as he was able to do in New Hampshire against George H.W. Bush, in his debate against Carter, Reagan succeeded in making the news of the debate all about him. On November 4th, as Americans made their way to the polls, both sides believed the election would be a nail-biter. That belief faded within 90 minutes of election returns coming in. It was clear even early on that Ronald Reagan would be the next president of the United States, and it wouldn't be close at all. Reagan won 489 electoral votes to Carter's 49. Carter carried his home state of Georgia, Mondale's home state of Minnesota, Maryland, Hawaii, West Virginia, Rhode Island, and the District of Columbia. John Anderson, running as an independent, secured under 7% of the popular vote, but no electoral votes. Reagan's percentage of the electoral vote was the highest ever won by a first-time president-elect other than George Washington. And riding on his coattails, Republicans reclaimed control of the United States Senate. This marked the first time the Republican Party had controlled either chamber of Congress since 1954. In his victory speech from Los Angeles, Ronald Reagan thanked all of his supporters on behalf of himself and his wife, Nancy. He thanked President Carter for his graciousness and then took a moment to give special thanks to the newly elected vice president and his wife, saying that no one worked harder for the campaign than George and Barbara Bush, and that he looked forward to having a true partnership and a true friendship in the White House. Reagan then spoke of his belief in the American people. "I am not frightened by what lies ahead," he said. "Together we're going to do what has to be done." Reagan's election would prove to be a seismic shift in the Republican Party and the American political system. The roots of modern conservatism had perhaps begun back in the 1964 election with the nomination of failed Republican candidate Barry Goldwater. But what Goldwater started, Reagan seemed determined to finish. The sixth party system, as it's called by historians, was crystallized with Reagan's election. And with his inauguration in January of 1981, America was in the throes of the Reagan Revolution. This is episode 49 of American Elections Wicked Game, 1980. Let's make America great again. On the next episode, the election of 1984. With a Republican-controlled Senate and a clear mandate from the American people, Ronald Reagan sets out to show American strength abroad and reduce the role of big government at home. The idea that his political future will ever be in question seems impossible, but a widening wealth gap and a lone gunman's bullet will threaten his first term and his prospects for re-election. This episode contains reenactments and dramatized details, and while in most cases we can't know exactly what was said, all our dramatizations are based on historical research. American Elections Wicked Game is an Airship production, hosted, edited, and executive produced by me, Lindsey Graham. Audio editing by Molly Bach. Sound design by Derek Behrens. Music by Lindsey Graham. Co-executive produced by Stephen Walters in association with Ritual Productions. Written and researched by Michael Federico. Fact-checking by Greg Jackson and Ciel Salazar from the podcast History That Doesn't Suck.
There's no escaping Murder Most Foul in my new weekly podcast, Rabia Chaudhry Presents The Mystery Hour with the Alfred Hitchcock and Ellery Queen Mystery Magazines. I'll lead you into twisty mysteries that will keep you on the edge of your seats and guessing until the very end. Written by award-winning mystery writers, we bring you a new whodunit each week. Search for The Mystery Hour on your favorite podcast app and subscribe now to experience the thrill of the best mystery storytelling in the world and let the murder mystery begin.